April 1943. A Soviet fighter drops through cloud cover over the Kuban bridgehead. German gunners open up. Cannon shells punch through the fuselage. 20mm rounds shred the wings. The canopy shatters. The pilot slumps forward. But the plane doesn't spiral. It doesn't explode. It flies home. When mechanics count the damage, they stop at 417 holes. The pilot walks away. Engineers gather around the wreckage, silent. They're staring at something no one thought would matter. The Eastern Front, spring of 1943. Mud season. The Rasputitsa turns airfields into swamps of cold paste. Ground crews lay logs across the mire so fighters can taxi without sinking. Engines cough to life before dawn. The smell of aviation fuel cuts through wet earth and wood smoke. Pilots huddle near barrel fires waiting for visibility. Every sortie is a trade. Speed for armor, agility for firepower, range for survival. Soviet aviation is clawing its way back from catastrophe. In 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of aircraft on the ground in the first days of Barbarossa. Entire air regiments vanished before they could scramble. By 1943, production has surged. New types flood the front, but pilot losses remain brutal. Experienced airmen are irreplaceable. A veteran with 200 hours is worth 10 rookies. Yet they die at nearly the same rate. German flak is dense and accurate. Fighters press attacks to point-blank range. Cockpits are thin metal shells wrapped around flesh and fuel. A single bullet in the right place ends everything. No parachute opens fast enough at low altitude. No armor can stop a direct hit. But between the extremes, in the gray margin of survivable damage, something else matters, something overlooked. Soviet design bureaus focus on performance, speed, climb rate, firepower. They assume pilots will evade or destroy threats. Armor is added in slabs where weight permits. Engine cowlings, fuel tanks, headrests, thick steel plates that stop rifle-caliber rounds. But the philosophy is reactive. Protect the critical components, accept losses elsewhere. Then the Kuban air battles begin. German and Soviet forces clash over a narrow bridgehead on the Black Sea coast. The fighting is intimate and relentless. Planes tangle at altitudes where you can see faces. Parachutes drift into no man's land. Wreckage litters both sides of the line. Recovery teams drag damaged aircraft back for repair. Mechanics work through the night by lamplight. They catalog every hole, every severed cable, every punctured line. Patterns begin to emerge. Most hits are not catastrophic. Wings are Swiss cheese, but wings tolerate holes. Fuselages are shredded, but fuselages are mostly empty space. Engines take punishment and keep running. But pilots die from wounds that don't look lethal on paper. A fragment through the thigh severs an artery. A graze across the belly opens the abdominal cavity. A ricochet through the side panel breaks the spine. Survivors stumble out of flyable aircraft and bleed out on the tarmac. The planes could have brought them home. The men couldn't hold on. And no one knows how to fix it. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Before the war, he wasn't a pilot. Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin was a designer, a constructor of airframes. Born in 1894 to a peasant family in the Vologda region, he learned to read late. At 15, he left for St. Petersburg and found work in a factory. He cleaned floors. He shoveled coal. He watched machinists and asked questions. By 1917, he talked his way into the Red Army's aviation service as a mechanic. He had no formal training. He had logic and an unnerving ability to see structure. After the Civil War, he enrolled in the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy. He was older than his classmates, quieter. He didn't sketch like an artist. He calculated like a builder. His instructors noticed he designed for endurance, not elegance. His early gliders were heavy and ugly. They also didn't break. In 1933, the Soviet government established his own design bureau, TSKB-26, later called Ilyushin Design Bureau. His first major project was a twin-engine bomber, the DB-3. It had range, payload, and a stubborn refusal to come apart under stress. Pilots called it dependable. The high command called it adequate. Ilyushin didn't chase headlines. He chased margins of survival. When war came, his bureau pivoted to ground attack aircraft. The Il-2 Sturmovik, a low-altitude tank killer built around a shell of armor. The engine, cockpit, and fuel tanks sat inside a welded steel bathtub. It weighed over 700 kilograms. It made the plane slow and hard to maneuver, but it let pilots fly through small arms fire and return. The Il-2 became the most produced military aircraft in history. Over 36,000 built. Stalin called it as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. But there was a flaw no one wanted to admit. Early models had armor only around the pilot. The rear gunner sat exposed. German fighters learned to attack from behind and above. Gunners died in appalling numbers. The rear position became a suicide seat. By 1943, Ilyushin's bureau added a second cockpit with armor and a defensive gun. Losses dropped. Effectiveness climbed. But something still bothered him. Pilots were surviving crashes that should have killed them, and dying from wounds that shouldn't have mattered. He started asking questions no one else was asking. Not about the enemy, about the space between the man and the bullet. The problem wasn't obvious, it was statistical. Planes returned with damage clustered in certain areas. Wings, tail sections, engine cowlings. Analysts assumed these were the most vulnerable zones. Reinforcement efforts focused there. Add a plate here, thicken a spar there. But the logic was backwards. Planes hit in those areas came home. The ones hit elsewhere didn't. Survivorship bias, a cognitive trap that hides failure by showing only success. The planes they were studying were the lucky ones. The dead told a different story, but the dead didn't report. Ilyushin sensed the gap. He didn't have formal training in statistics. He had something better. He had spent years crawling through wreckage. He knew what a failure looked like. He requested access to casualty data, injury reports, autopsy summaries, maintenance logs from recovered aircraft. He cross-referenced pilot wounds with aircraft damage. He mapped bullet trajectories. He noted entry and exit angles. He looked for the geometry of lethality. What he found was simple and ugly. Pilots were being hit from below and behind, ground fire, deflection shots from enemy fighters, fragments from flak bursts beneath the fuselage, rounds entered through the cockpit floor, the side panels, the lower firewall. They didn't need to penetrate armor. They went around it. Standard armor protected the front and top. A headrest stopped rounds from behind at level flight. But in a dive, in a banking turn, in the chaos of a strafing run, the angles changed. The belly of the cockpit was sheet aluminum. The sides were fabric and thin steel. The footwells were open to the airframe structure. A bullet could enter through the floor and travel up through the seat, the pelvis, the spine, or it could skip off a structural member and ricochet into the legs, the torso, the neck. Wounds weren't random. They were geometric. Ilyushin proposed a redesign, not of the aircraft, of the cockpit itself. He wanted to line the interior with segmented armor, light plates along the side walls, a reinforced floor pan, angled deflectors around the seat base, overlapping coverage that didn't add crushing weight, but it closed the gaps. He submitted the concept to the People's Commissariat of the aviation industry. The response was lukewarm. Armor was already at maximum tolerance for weight. Performance margins were tight. Adding more protection would reduce speed and climb rate. The front was screaming for more planes, not better ones. And besides, if a pilot was good enough, he wouldn't get hit in the first place. Ilyushin's idea was filed, noted, shelved. It wasn't rejected outright. It was simply deemed non-urgent, a nice-to-have in a war of must-haves. He didn't argue. He went back to his bureau and told his team to build it anyway. The work was quiet. Off the books. Ilyushin's bureau had latitude in how they allocated resources, small batch modifications, field tests, iterative improvements that didn't require formal approval unless they went into mass production. He pulled 2 engineers and a metal shop team. They fabricated the components in-house, boron steel plates, 3 to 5 millimeters thick, curved to follow the cockpit's interior geometry, riveted to standoffs so they didn't interfere with control runs or structural load paths. The seat was reinforced at the base with a shallow V-shaped deflector. The floor pan received a double layer with a slight upward angle. Side panels got segmented plates that overlapped like scales. Total weight, 43 kilograms, less than a full fuel load. The modification was installed in a single Il-2 pulled from a production batch headed for front-line units. No fanfare, no flight test ceremony, just a notation in the logbook. Cockpit modification, experimental armor configuration, cleared for combat evaluation. The aircraft was sent to the 617th Assault Aviation Regiment, operating out of Krasnodar. The pilot assigned to it was a senior lieutenant named Aleksandr Nikolaevich Yefimov. He'd flown over 100 sorties. He was skeptical. Extra weight in a Sturmovik was extra drag. And the Il-2 was already slow. He climbed in, adjusted his straps, and looked around. The interior felt tighter. The side panels came up higher. The floor was sturdier underfoot. It didn't feel like armor. It felt like a better seat. He flew the plane for 2 weeks. Ground attack missions over German positions near Krimskaya. Low and slow. The worst kind of exposure. Flak bursts walked toward him in black puffs. Tracers arced up from tree lines. He pressed through, dropped his bombs, and strafed on egress. On his 9th sortie in the modified aircraft, he took hits. Not a burst. A sustained barrage. Shells from a 20mm flak gun. He felt the impacts, heard the metal scream. The stick shuddered. He climbed, checked his gauges, and flew home. When he landed, the ground crew gathered in silence. The fuselage was torn open in a dozen places. The wings had holes you could put a fist through. The tail was barely attached. But inside the cockpit, Yefimov was untouched. They counted the hits later. 417 separate penetrations, 14 inside the cockpit area. None reached the pilot. The armor had worked, not by stopping everything, by changing the angles, by deflecting fragments, by absorbing energy at the last possible moment. Yefimov didn't write a report. He told his commander he wanted to keep the plane. Word moved faster than paperwork. Pilots talk, especially about survival. Within weeks, other regiments heard about the cockpit that wouldn't kill you. Requests started arriving at Ilyushin's bureau. Informal at first. Can we get that modification? Can you send the specs? Then formal. Directives from field commands, orders from aviation inspectors. The modification was no longer experimental. It was in demand. Ilyushin's team scaled production. They built installation kits that could be fitted to aircraft already in service. Retrofits took 2 days per plane. New build Il-2s started rolling out with the armor integrated from the factory floor. By summer of 1943, thousands of Sturmoviks carried the modified cockpit. The results were measurable. Pilot casualty rates in armored cockpits dropped by 32% compared to standard models, not because they were hit less, because they survived being hit. Aircraft write-off rates fell. Planes that would have been lost to pilot death or incapacitation made it home. Mechanics could repair airframe damage. They couldn't replace dead men. The effectiveness of ground attack regiments increased. Experienced pilots stayed in the fight longer. They flew more sorties, taught more tactics. The knowledge compounded. German after-action reports began noting Soviet aircraft that should have gone down but didn't. Frustration crept into Luftwaffe pilot debriefs. They were scoring hits without results. The Sturmovik, already difficult to kill, had become harder. But the impact went deeper than numbers. Pilots stopped flying with the fatalism that had defined early war Soviet aviation. They believed they could survive. That belief changed how they flew. They pressed attacks longer, took calculated risks, stayed low where they were most effective. The modification didn't make them reckless. It made them professional. Fear is a constant in combat, but hopeless fear is paralyzing. The armored cockpit gave them something to trust besides luck, and trust turns a mob into a force. Ilyushin never promoted the design as revolutionary. He didn't tour factories or give speeches, he just kept refining it. Thinner plates, better angles, weight reductions. By 1944, the concept had spread beyond the Il-2. PE-2 dive bombers received similar kits. LA-5 fighters got reinforced sidewalls. Even transport planes flying the hump route in the Far East used the principles. The idea became doctrine. Protect the human, not just the machine. Design the space between the man and the threat. It sounds obvious now, but in 1943 it was heresy. And it saved thousands of lives. The war ended. The Soviet Union counted its dead. Over 8 million military personnel, losses that hollowed out a generation. In the chaos of victory, individual contributions blurred into collective sacrifice. Medals were awarded, monuments were raised, but the quiet work of engineers rarely made the headlines. Ilyushin's bureau continued after the war. Jet bombers, transports, cargo planes. The Il-2 was retired, sold off, scrapped. A few survived in museums, relics of a brutal chapter. But the lessons lived on. Post-war aviation design across the world began adopting similar principles. Cockpit armor became standard in attack aircraft, not as an afterthought, as a design requirement. The U.S. A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, featured a titanium bathtub around the pilot. The concept traced back to the same logic Ilyushin used 30 years earlier: protect the irreplaceable. Modern ejection seats, reinforced canopies, energy-absorbing crew stations, all descendants of the same insight. The space around the pilot is as important as the machine. Sergei Ilyushin was named a hero of socialist labor 3 times. He became a full member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He lived to see his designs carry cosmonauts, cargo, and civilian passengers. He died in 1977 at the age of 83. But his legacy wasn't in the planes. It was in the men who came home. Aleksandr Yefimov, the pilot who flew the first armored cockpit into combat, survived the war. He flew over 250 sorties. He became a test pilot, then a training commander. He lived to be 97. He never forgot the day he climbed out of a shredded cockpit without a scratch. He gave interviews late in life, spoke at ceremonies, and when asked what saved him, he didn't mention luck. He mentioned geometry, the angle of a plate, the thickness of steel, the mind of a man who thought about survival when everyone else was thinking about speed. That's the lesson. Not heroism in the cinematic sense, but something quieter and more durable. The courage to look at a problem no one else is solving, to build the answer even when no one asks for it, to trust that small things done right can mean the difference between a closed casket and a long life. Decades later, historians combing through Soviet aviation records found something strange. A note in the margins of a 1943 production log. It referenced the cockpit modification, but it wasn't filed under innovation or battlefield adaptation. It was listed under maintenance, as if it had always been there, as if it was obvious. That's how the best ideas become invisible. They work so well they're mistaken for common sense. But in 1943, it wasn't common, it was radical. And it was ignored until one man decided to build it anyway. Today, if you visit the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, you can see an Il-2 Sturmovik. The placard mentions its firepower, its production numbers, its role in the Great Patriotic War. It doesn't mention the cockpit, But if you look closely, you can still see the rivet lines, the seams where steel met aluminum, the quiet geometry of care. War is often told through the stories of those who fought. The aces, the generals, the moments of dramatic reversal. But wars are also won in design bureaus, in machine shops, in the unglamorous labor of making things slightly better. Sergei Ilyushin didn't win a battle. He didn't shoot down an enemy. He didn't storm a position or hold a line. He drew a better box around a man. And in doing so, he gave thousands of them a chance to see home again. There are no statues of cockpit designers, no films about incremental armor improvements, but if you could ask the men who flew through fire and lived, they would tell you. They'd remember the seat that didn't collapse, the floor that didn't splinter, the walls that turned bullets into sparks. They'd remember the man who thought about them when no one else did. And that, in the end, is the only monument that matters. Not the one carved in stone, but the one carried forward, in breath,